everybody, and welcome to the 7th Google Hangout session of the Read for Pixels 4th Annual International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasavam. I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning and best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. We aim to raise $1 million to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. I'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in the session. But if you want to find out more about Read for Pixels and the Pixel Project, please go to thepixelproject.net. So today we have a special guest. We have live discussion and a Q&A session with the wonderful Dana Cameron. Now, whether it's writing science fiction or fantasy or horror or noir or historical fiction or thrillers or traditional mystery, Dana Cameron draws from her expertise in archaeology. Her work has won multiple Agatha Anthony McCavity Awards and earned an Edgar Award nomination, and the Emma Fielding mysteries have been optioned by News Entertainment. The movie Sight Unseen debuted in 2017 at Hallmark Movies and Mystery Channel. Now, Dana has very generously donated one very cool bundle of stories book bundle to the stash of author goodies that we have set up as perks for donors on our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So this bundle comprises of one set of Fangborn Trilogy, which is paperback, and it's signed and personalized. One copy of Finals, which is a Fangborn story originally published in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine. One Night, The Night the Things Changed. One A.B. Fangborn story originally published in Wolfsbane and Mistletoe, edited by Charlene Harris and Tony L.P. Kellner. And one Little Gun Snake Stuffy, because Dana's vampires have a serpentine form. This bundle is only available for US donors. Now, all funds go towards the Pixel Project Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. Please do give generously. For this fundraiser, we have a $5,000 goal. We're only at $2,360, so just a little less than half, so any little amount helps. I'll be telling you how you can donate and how you can get your hands on all these wonderful goodies a little later in the session, so stay tuned for that. Before that, Dana's going to do a little reading, and then we'll have a live discussion and a Q&A session. You can participate in the Q&A session. You can ask Dana your questions by typing them into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, you do have to be signed in to do this. So before Dana gets to the reading, I'm going to give everybody a little warning. The trigger warning, there's some swearing and there's some queer bashing and some violence, but don't worry, the bad guys get their comeuppance in the end. So I'm going to switch the screen to Dana now. Hi, Dana.
Hi, Anusha. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. We're so glad that you're here. I can tell this is going to be a really fun session. So do you want to get into your reading now?
I'd be happy to do that. I will be reading from 7 Kinds of Hell. It's the first of my Fangborn books, and I'll be reading from the 2nd chapter. My protagonist is named Zoe Miller. She's an archaeology student, and this is the first time she's used her werewolf powers that she has heretofore been unfamiliar with to fight evil. The first time the beast came 8 years ago, I was certain I'd lost my mind. It was shortly after I turned 16. Ma was at work when the landlord came up to badger us for the rent. We'd already told him we'd have it when Ma got paid that night, but he was being a prick, yelling, threatening eviction. When he opened the door, something he should not have done, I felt something come over me, and all I could do was think about ripping out his throat. Images played out in my mind, and I knew exactly how it would go down. Never had I felt rage as simple and clean and demanding as that before. The look on his face as he backed off rocked me. It was all I could do to shut the door and chain it behind me. That kind of violent response shouldn't have felt as good as it did. That was my first clue that I was going nuts. The experience was like opening a door to a whole different suite of rooms I never knew existed inside me. I was terrified as I was exhilarated, and if I hadn't felt the alien destructive feelings, and if I hadn't seen the flash of retracting fangs in the mirror as I splashed cold water on my face, I would have spent the whole day trying to get that feeling back. As it was, I was so convinced I was going crazy, I had my bag packed and was ready to leave when my mother came home. All I could tell her was that the landlord was hassling us, hitting on me, and I wanted to move on. No, I didn't tell her the truth. If you had no family and friends you only saw once in a blue moon because you're always moving, would you risk losing the only person you had in the world when you thought you might be going nuts? We left. Mom was ready to jam anyway, and I did my best to convince myself it was a flash of hormones or a bad burrito or anything besides me going loopy. Until that point, I had never touched drugs and sneaked a beer only once in a while, so I had no idea when the beast would return. Until it did. A year after the landlord visit was the first time the beast caught me out in public. That time wasn't the worst, but it changed me forever and sealed the deal for me that something was not right with Zoe. I wasn't exercising good judgment that night, and I now wonder if this had been pure coincidence. Yes, it was a full moon, and some people claim they can feel the moon directing them, strengthening them. I felt those urges myself, but rather than try to figure it out, I tried to blot them out. That night, I found myself at a party of a friend's. Being young and stupid and thinking it would be okay this time, I drank too much. The more I wanted to get drunk, the less I could shut off my feelings. I craved a little oblivion, even at the cost of raggedy, personally embarrassing evening. But it wouldn't happen. No matter how hard I tried to get wrecked, I couldn't. Eventually, very late, I said goodbye and took the long way home, hoping the cold air would somehow force the alcohol into my system. Down the block, the last lights in the darkened cinema clicked off, the late show having let out 20 minutes earlier. A young man set an alarm and locked the door, the manager maybe, or the last of the late shift workers. He looked around, put the keys in his pocket, and set off down the street ahead of me, another lonely soul. Lonely, maybe, but not alone. 3 men stepped out of the shadows in front of him. Faggot, we told you we'd be back. He kept his head down, kept walking. It was a pretty stupid thing to do. If someone's threatening, you don't turn your back on them. I knew from experience you can't wish away trouble like that. But he quickly lengthened the distance between him and the others, so maybe he knew what he was doing. Hey, faggot, I'm talking to you. One of them raced up and before he could move, grabbed his arm. The kid did know what he was doing. He pulled out a can of pepper spray and soaked the guy with it. The attacker grabbed his eyes and screamed. The kid stepped in and aimed a stream at him. He should have run. His attacker flailed and, with a lucky shot, managed to knock the canister out of his hand. The kid ran then. The guy he nailed was screaming curses and crying, rubbing his eyes, which only made things worse. Made it worse for the kid, too, because the other two decided it was time to join in. One rushed him, throwing hard punches at his head. The kid went down. The other, having checked on his blinded friend, was now screaming himself. He kicked the prone kid several times. It all happened in less than a minute. It took forever. I was frozen, unable to scream for help. I stared as the scene unfolded, unable to think. The cheap, prepaid phone in my pocket never even occurred to me. Everything slowed to a glacial pace. Eternities passed between heartbeats, and even as the violence seemed to pause, it was as if a movie was running in my head, several minutes faster than the reality unfolding around me. I knew exactly what was coming next. I had no idea. How could I have known? They would drag the barely conscious man to the sidewalk, blood streaming from his face, his hand bent back at an unnatural angle. They would place his head on the curbstone, open his mouth, and stomp on his head, splitting his jaw on the anvil of the asphalt. I shuddered. A surge tore through my body. I felt the confinement of flesh fall away, and a strong, sure connection with the universe seized me. It was coupled with an equally foreign feeling of strength. And suddenly the men before me, between punches 2 and 3, slowed and stopped. Two thoughts struggled to make themselves known in the tumultuous rush of emotions and sensations I felt. One, the energy drinks and vodka had definitely caught up with me. I was unhinged with power, and oddly, goodness. Two, if I'd been once labeled a troubled child, trouble was calling me louder and more comprehensive than ever before. I was going to stop this. I could smell the sweat on each of the men, sense as individual as the men themselves. The dissipating odor of pepper spray tingled and burned. I could practically taste the blood as it streamed from the prone man, its molecules dancing, ruby luminous and hypnotic. I could hear heavy breathing and heartbeats, crickets from an empty lot down the street, a radio from a car a mile away. And the moon, oh, the moon. The cold silver light suffused my veins, animating me, making me magic. Time snapped back into its groove, but the men did not continue the beating. The idea of the curb, so vivid in my mind, as if a direct link from my mind to theirs, faded. They turned away from the victim and froze. They were staring at me. I was growling. It was not the noise of a small woman frustrated with the unfairness of the universe, not a personal, muffled noise of determination or resistance. It was animal violence, loud and warning. The louder it got, the more I felt it in the strength. Oh my God, the power. I stepped forward and found myself hindered, tangled in my clothing. Nightmarishly, I couldn't make my hands pull at my jeans. I had paws. A distant part of me wanted to stop, but I didn't. I felt too right. Instinct drove me now. If I had paws, I had claws. I had a mouthful of teeth. I snapped and tore at the fabric. My legs and my tail were freed. With the moon singing in my blood, power coursing through me, a lifetime of unfairness and fear falling away, I had one objective. Fix this. There was another thought in the corner of my brain. What the fuck was in that Red Bull cocktail anyway? I turned back to the men who were still staring when they should have been running. 3 long, leaping paces and I was on them. Although I felt entirely capable of tearing their throats out, something kept me from doing so. An impulse suggested they weren't worthy of that kind of punishment. My intervention would make them reconsider their role in the world and their all too willing use of violence. How could I have known that? I shook one by the scruff of the neck, then nipped the other one, almost playfully, savoring their fear, enjoying my power. If it was a hallucination, it was a good one. I'd willingly pay 6 or 7 hangovers for that sensation again. The first 2 ran. The other remained, stunned. I didn't feel the same urge to limit violence with him. I had a compulsion, a need to end him. A natural urge, an unnatural. I hurled myself at him, my soul blazing with its righteous mania. I clamped down onto his shoulder with my teeth, reveling in his screams. His blood was ambrosial and wrong. The taste of his wrongness told me I'd been correct in my assessment. He needed to go. Instincts ablaze, I should have anticipated he wouldn't run away. I should have anticipated the response, a yank of my clothing and a brick upside the head. I fell, stunned, a cathedral landing on top of my skull. Yet the compulsion to attack remained. I struggled up, shaking my head, and saw him heading around a corner. To a car, I knew, somehow. I tried to run, but tangled up in my clothing, I stumbled, landing hard, skidding on my chin. I saw stars. I passed out and awoke with my clothes knotted around me, twisted, torn, and dirty. The young man who'd been the victim of the attack was sitting up, gingerly dabbing at his nose, which was streaming blood. He stared at me, dragging himself away painfully, his wounded hand useless, cradled in his lap. What the fuck? I'm sorry, they're gone. He shook his head. You turned into a wolf. Somehow I was less concerned that he and I were having the same hallucination than the fact that he seemed to believe it. That increased my panic. I shook my head, rearranged my clothes as best I could without seeming too nervous. It was time to leave. Terror filled his eyes, his back at the wall. He couldn't get any farther away from me. What are you? I'm really scared. I'm late. I gotta go. Then I got up and ran away, hard as I could.
Oh, thanks, Dana. That was pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight into a bunch of questions that I have, and then I'm going to ask some fan questions because they're slowly coming in right now.
Oh, great.
Okay, so my first question is about the female characters in all your stories. So these female characters, they're generally resourceful and smart. They're determined young women. They go after what they want, be it in their jobs or their personal lives. What inspires you to create these characters? Or who inspired you?
Oh, gosh. I started writing fiction because someone came onto a site where my boss and I were working and pointed a gun at us. He was trying to steal artifacts using a metal detector, and when my boss spoke up, he threatened to shoot us. And I was mapping the site. I was behind a transit, which is a small piece of equipment. It's not a lot to hide behind when someone's pointing a gun at you. And I didn't know, would he shoot us? Would he not shoot us if I did something? So I decided I would memorize everything I could about him. And then if something happened, I'd run into the woods, try to find a ranger. And eventually he left because the woman he was with said that they didn't want trouble. And oh gosh, I'm like, he's the one who pulled the gun on us. You're making the trouble. But eventually they left, and we found the sheriff and the park ranger and filed a report. And months after the dig, I was talking to a friend about this, and she said, "You need to write this down." And it occurred to me, I always wanted to be a writer. And this was sort of the motivation. I had gone into archaeology because I didn't want to, I thought as a writer, I had to have adventures, and I didn't want to have adventures. I wanted to be a researcher and learn things, but I had an adventure or two in spite of myself. And so part of it was me writing about the kind of life I wanted to have. Emma Fielding, my archaeology professor, she had the job that I was trying to find at the time. Everything was sort of working against her, but she had one good thing in her life, and that was her husband and her love of her work and her friends and family. I had the same thing. I had, I was looking for a job in a tough market, but I had my husband and my family who were very supportive. Zoe, I wanted her to feel less assured, less mature than Emma did. Because if she's also figuring out that she's a werewolf and she finds out there's this community of werewolves and vampires in the world, I wanted her to be the one the reader would go along with to learn about the Fangborn and their powers and the fact that they are secret superheroes. So part of it was me sort of wishing for a stable professional life for myself as a professor. And some of it is me writing about women in the world. For example, Zoe is very small physically. She and her mother don't have a lot of money. They're on the run for various reasons. And I wanted her to suddenly be aware that she had this massive amount of power that she could use, but how would she use it? And that was the thing that was interesting to me. I have other characters I've written about who were victims of abuse in one way or another, and sometimes that was legally sanctioned or societally sanctioned. And what do you do when you're faced with something like that? So it's these questions of how do women find power in the world that really intrigue me.
That's interesting. Now, you mentioned in an interview, I think it was last year, that you experienced gender bias during your work as an archaeologist. And then you went on to create Emma Fielding, a great female archaeologist, a professor, a solver of mysteries. And when you created her, were you also purposefully creating a female role model who pushes against gender stereotypes? What do you think makes and defines an effective character role model in this regard?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it happens in every field. I think academia is no different. And I have, of course, encountered those kind of biases, looking for someone who's a stronger guy to work on a dig, because obviously I was too small and frail to run, to work on a dig, which is not the case. Or people promoting men ahead of me who did not have their degrees finished, for example. But I wanted Emma to be the person who I was aspiring to be, and someone who would be able to deal with this stuff in a wise and productive manner. And so I was kind of teaching myself by writing her and sort of like, what do I aspire to be? And I think people joke about writers talking about their characters being better than they are, but I think it's something we choose to teach ourselves. And to a certain extent, Zoe was part of that too, despite the fact that she was coming at things from a very much less powerful position than Emma. When I started finding my voice as a writer, that was almost like Zoe finding her power as a werewolf and someone who could fight evil. And so I was taking cues from her. And I think we create characters that we often, not all the time, but often we create characters that we want to emulate in some way. Okay. Sort of training wheels.
Yeah, which kind of leads me to my next question, which is about Zoe in the Fangborn series. Now, she's not your typical urban fantasy hero. She's not all powerful. She has a learning curve because she's learning about herself and all these and the paranormal people at the same time. She makes mistakes. She's not effortlessly stylish, and she makes she makes difficult decisions using her brain. So her experiences actually, they pretty much mirror the experiences of many women in the world. So was it So are you saying that it was a conscious decision on your part to portray her this way, or did she just kind of was she just born and did she just evolve organically like this?
I really wanted her to be someone who was totally at sea at first. As I mentioned before, she's not imposing physically. She's not coming from a family with great wealth and power. And then she's got all these questions that she doesn't know about until she learns that the Fangborn are a real family of supernatural creatures. She has no idea of what she's going through. So I very much wanted her to be figuring out how to use that power. And then as we went along, she kept surprising me by figuring out things that she could do that other Fangborn couldn't do, and what she would choose to do with that. And that affected her personal life as well. And she realized, gosh, I'm outgrowing people I thought would be my loves forever. And I guess I'm changing. But she's taking charge of those changes, which I really I admire about her. When I realized that she was going to be making changes in the person who was most important in her romantic life, I was like, oh, no, but it totally made sense. And I was like, but I meant them to be together forever. And it's like, well, no, she's grown out of that relationship. And so I really liked the fact that she had enough of a character to say, no, I've got other plans. I have other plans to do.
Yeah, which kind of almost answers one of the fan questions. So we have a question from Margaret Rushton, and
Oh,
she
hi,
said,
Margaret.
she asked, Dana, when you're writing, do you ever have the story move in a direction that you hadn't considered, or does the story go exactly how you planned?
Oh no, it's always a surprise, and that's what I like about it.
Mm.
I am. There are two types of writers, generally speaking. There are the folks who outline everything. I have friends who do 50-page outlines, and they can't write until they've done that. I am known as an organic writer or a pantser, someone who flies by the seat of their pants. I have an idea of something I want to have happen, and so I write that down, and then I don't know what's going to happen after, but I need to know how I got there, and so it's just solving a puzzle. And for me, that's the most fun because that way you can figure out you're on the adventure as well. If you solve it all ahead of time, for me it's quite dry to write it down. So when my characters surprise me, that is a good day. That's a happy day because it means that my brain is working on the story and the characters are working on the story with me, if you see what I mean. So
Yeah,
yeah, no, it's always a surprise, and that's the best part of it for me.
that sounds really fun. Okay, so I'm a little more serious question. Do you ever feel constrained by gender stereotypes? Like, do you feel you need to give your female characters a certain amount of femininity to make them likable or relatable? And how do you, if you do feel constrained, how do you work around these kind of stereotypes?
That's a tough one because the whole issue of a likable character is really tough because for example, in the movie Salt with Angelina Jolie, she's playing this very tough special agent or spy, and I'm like, I could tell like now she's going to pat a dog, and now she's going to be nice to a kid, and she's going to be, and it's like, okay, so now we know that she's a decent person, and you can, I mean, it was quite literally those kind of beats. I wrote a character in a couple of stories for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. I call her Jane. I'm not sure what her name is anymore because she's changed it so many times. And she is a covert operative who is retired, but she still has a sense of obligation that if she sees bad people doing bad things, she's going to step in. And she's not nice. She does have a dog, but the dog's not usually there. So it's like, but she was my response to characters like, Jack Reacher, or a lot of the tough male characters who seem to be very single-minded about how they do things. And I said, well, gosh, I want to have some fun like that too. I mean, like in the movie G.I. Jane,
Mm.
one of the doctors asked her, why are you doing this terribly hard program? She goes, well, what do the guys say? And they say, well, we want to blow things up. And I'm like, yes, that's the answer. I want to have that kind of adventure too.
Yeah.
But it's difficult because you have to convey, at least for me, I want my characters to have a core of decency, even if it's not a likable sort, if it's not a recognizably feminine sort. It's that they could be tough and even brutal when they're trying to right a wrong. And so sometimes I have other characters who are on their side who seem worse than them to sort of make a comparison. Sometimes I have characters questioning them, saying, my God, how can you do this? And so I try to play it out that way. But it is difficult because sometimes it's just fun to have something with lots of explosions for me. But also, I try to give the characters enough depth so that you can see that it's not just random violence. It's someone achieving a goal through a not terribly likable set of abilities.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because women, there are all kinds of people are of women as well as there are all kinds of men. So you could have a woman who is, hard and tough and not really feminine. Yeah, but she's still a person.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry.
Go on.
I was going to say, I have another character, 18th century tavern keeper in Boston named Anna Hoyt that has also showed up in a couple of short stories. And she, from all appearances, is the perfect 18th century lady. She's very nicely put together. She's very demure. She's quite lovely and seems very gentle. But then she gets put into circumstances that no human being should be expected to bear. And she chooses to live. And that's not necessarily likable, but what's very interesting to me is that she is just choosing to have her life and fight for that. And people are always a little shy about saying, I really like Anna. She's tough. But she's kind of blood curdling as well. So it's difficult because when you write a character like that, you have to realize that they're not always going to be necessarily popular, but there are different responses to oppression of all sorts. And it's interesting for me to explore those.
Yeah, I think, and it's interesting, I think, to see people's reactions to them and how they go. In your opinion, as a novelist, how important is it to have a strong female characters, not just in novels but in pop culture as a whole, like film and movies and things like that? And why do you think it's important?
Oh, man, for me, everything representation, seeing yourself in the fictional world is so important because it lets you know what you can do. It lets you know in some small way what's possible. It's if you don't see yourself in these roles reflected to you from the television screen or movies or comic books or fiction, then you think, well, where do I fit into this world? And you end up feeling quite left out. And I remember particularly seeing, I think it was an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and thinking, oh my gosh, that nerdy girl over there, that Willow, I know who she is. I know who she is. I'm she,
Yeah.
And it was one of those things like, okay, she doesn't necessarily have, a gift to slay vampires, but she has learned things and she knows what to do with them. I'm like, oh, that's cool. When you see that in a comic book or something, it's huge because it's like, oh, hey, that person looks like me or that person thinks like I do. And I think that just gives you a whole different way of looking at yourself in the world. And I that's why I write almost exclusively main female characters and my main point of view characters, because it just, I want to read that novel. I want to be in that novel. So
yeah. Have you watched the Black Panther movie?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, what do you think about that? Like, because there were so many women there. I mean, the main character is a man, obviously, and the villain is a man, but they were surrounded by all these amazing women. Like his mother, his love interest, the general, all the warriors. They were all women, and that was so amazing.
Oh, and Shuri, his sister.
Yeah, and his sister. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Oh, that movie I've seen a couple times now. I'll go see a couple more times because they were strong women in an equal world, and it was very unlike, say, Wonder Woman, which I loved as well, but it was different. The feminism for me wasn't as strong there. But seeing the Black Panther, the way that the Dora Milaje warriors were, oh, it was amazing.
It was so cool, right?
Yeah. It's like, okay, first I want to get a visiting fellowship, a teaching at Themyscira University with the Amazons, and then I want to study at the University of Wakanda for a while.
I
want
to go be an intern at the lab with his sister and just help her out. Yeah, that was so cool. We have another question from Margaret Rushton. She asked, do you think it's more difficult for women that write fantasy and horror to get published over male writers of the same genre?
Wow, that's tough because I have only written one or two stories that I would call horror. But from what I hear from other writers, particularly women, it is difficult because people, as with every branch of publishing, um, tend to go with what's familiar. And to a lot of people, that tends to be male characters with male protagonists. So I think that I would feel more comfortable talking about that generally, saying, yeah, it's more difficult for women across the board. And so I assume it's the same for horror. Um, I know that some people are actively trying to change that with different collections that um, are actively soliciting stories from women and people of color and trans people, and trying to change that. But it takes a lot of work. But the thing is, there are plenty of good writers who are women out there writing all these genres, so it's not as big a deal. It's not as hard. It's just, I think in some instances, the women have to say, yes, okay, I'm going to find them as well. I can submit to that because my story can stand up with these other ones, and that's difficult to learn too.
All right. Well, keep your questions coming, guys. I'm going to go on to the next cluster of my questions, and then I'm going to move on to any fan questions that come in. Okay, so Dana, we've been speaking a lot about female characters, but your books have a lot of male characters as well, and they are supportive of the women and they have relationships with. For example, Emma Fielding has her husband, and Zoe has her friends and her cousin, and there are so many other examples. But there are, of course, men who are the bad guys, and there are
Yep.
people who are, you may think they're the bad guys, but maybe they're not the bad guys. And they all provide nice juxtaposition with the male characters who are 100% behind the female characters. So why did you write these male characters in this way, and why is it important to portray such male characters?
Well, as I mentioned with Emma, I wanted her. At first, I was thinking, well, she's got everything going against her. She's trying to get tenure in her job. She has her friend has been murdered, and she's got all these problems. And I was thinking, well, maybe she should also have a difficult relationship with her husband. I'm like, no, she should have one good thing. And I'm lucky enough. I patterned a lot of Brian on my own husband, who is fabulous. I'll say it. And I've had so many good friends who model what, to me, is the best of being male. And they are supportive. They will ask you a question rather than assuming something. And to me, I want more of that in my life. So I want to put it in my books. I want to spend time with those kinds of people. And with Zoe, I mean, she runs into all sorts of men. I mean, there's her friend, her cousin. She thinks of her as her cousin Danny, who's quite slight and very much an intellectual. And then there's Will, who was her teaching assistant back in the day, and then there are people who are quite brutal, but also have hidden depths. And I think people aren't one thing. There are all different ways of being a guy. And I think that's important, as it is to show there are lots of different ways of being a woman. So I want, for the most part, if I can hang out with people in my fiction who are people I'd like to hang out with in real life, then it makes me much happier. It's hard to write unsympathetic people.
Yeah.
And I don't always think that they are necessarily perfect. And in fact, most often they're not. But I want to be with the people who are trying to be good people.
Now, but how do you think stories that explore the theme that women can be strong and men should respect women will translate into putting a stop to violence against women?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
So how do you think stories that explore the theme that women can be strong and that men should respect women can translate into putting a stop to violence against women in real life?
I think it works on both sides. You have to have women being able to catch themselves and saying, no, I don't want you to treat me like that, and here's what I'd like to have. But you also have to have, example, it could be a man or another woman saying, okay, I don't know how to interact with you in this situation. Can you inform me? And I think it really comes down to being inquisitive. and saying, okay, you seem to be acting very in an unfamiliar way in this situation. Can you please tell me what's going on? Rather than just reacting and saying, oh my God, you're being so crazy or so mad about this. And it comes down to being clear-headed enough in a moment to ask a question. And so I think by creating the anecdotes in my books and stories where people are trying to understand each other because they don't get where the other person's coming from, or the other person's a werewolf and didn't know it, it's sort of a way of practicing those conversations, because it's difficult to say, no, I have to change the way that we're interacting. And it takes a lot of guts on both sides. So I think for me, some of the writing is practice for that, and trying to remember to set myself that example.
It leads me to the question of consent. So a lot of in a lot of urban fantasy or fantasy in general, there is this blurred line between consent, sexual consent especially. Do you think that this kind of thing is being addressed properly by authors nowadays, or are people still not really exploring it well enough?
I think the fact that we can have a conversation about that and about what that means is huge. Assuming if you are watching a traditional sort of fairy tale that the prince will end up with the princess is being challenged more and more. I mean, you think about some of Neil Gaiman's short stories where the princess is like, no, I think we're not going to get married today. I think I'm going to go off and have an adventure. Or I think that is that notion of sort of meek acceptance of a situation is being challenged. Not enough. I will still stand up and want to throw something at the television when I see, someone getting swept off of her feet, to use the expression. But I think the fact that we are talking about it and people are trying is so heartening to me. It's little steps at a time, but they're steps being taken.
Now, stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about change. In your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about tough human rights issues like violence against women and telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
Oh man, it's tough. I mean, that's the same problem I have coming from an academic background, where I want my stories to be historically accurate or accurately depicting the life of an archaeologist, but I'm not writing a dissertation. I have to remember that it's a story I'm telling first. And that has to be the most interesting and important thing. And I think there are, it's when you just try to be subtle about it and you work these issues into the everyday life of the characters where they don't see that there's a great difference in the way that people should be treated depending on their gender. I think that when it's subtle, it sort of sneaks in there. It's like, oh, hey, that was just very matter of fact. And it's like, that's a world I wouldn't mind living in. We mentioned that before when we were watching, we were talking about Black Panther. And it's like, it's not a clash of men versus women. It's people arguing things too because they are equals. And I think it's making it that matter of fact and making it a subtle thing is the real trick. But it certainly can be done.
Now, you are best known for your mystery thrillers, and violence does come built into the genre. How do you find a balance between showing violence as an integral part of the story and not showing violence for its own sake?
Oh, it's tough because my Emma Fielding mysteries in general they tend to have most of the violence off the screen. There are a few action scenes, but I want it to be more about the puzzle. I want it to be more about justice and doing what's right, as opposed to coming down to a shootout and fist fight.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's it just depends on the angle you want to take. If you're writing a story because you really want to talk a lot about these very cool weapons or something, that's one thing. It's going to be a totally different thing. But if you're trying to write a story that has people interacting, then that's when you start making those choices about how you're going to show these things. And for example, one of my friends was talking about a character. She's like, well, she keeps getting hit on the head. And I'm thinking, well, why doesn't she learn self-defense, or why doesn't she make a decision about how to, about getting a cell phone or a walkie-talkie or something? And it's, how would I prefer to handle those situations? So it can be a very a personal response depending on the type of story you're writing.
All right. Do you have any advice for authors who are thinking of tackling the issue of violence against women in their stories?
I have been learning this myself, and I think that every time you have the inclination to write a scene that depicts violence against women, is there a more elegant way of showing the problem? If you're just having a violent scene with a woman who's the victim, is there a way that you can show the bad guy being bad another way? If you decide, if you find yourself like the girlfriend in the refrigerator is the name of the trope that they use in movies a lot, and things like she's only there to make an excuse for the hero to do something heroic. Why not find another reason? There's lots of reasons for people to do things, and it doesn't always have to involve a depiction of violence against women. Can you change it up? Can you make it someone else? Or if it starts feeling funny that way, then maybe you shouldn't have that scene in the first place. But it's always like, when you see something like that, say, is this the best way to tell this story, or is it just a sort of laziness? Is it just a convenience that you can work a little bit harder and get around?
Which kind of brings me to the next question, which is the Staunch Book Prize for Thrillers has just been launched in the wake of the Me Too movement. Now, this is a book prize for books that for thrillers that do not contain any violence against women. So this prize has kind of polarized novelists. Some of them applaud it, and others argue that it does no good to ignore violence against women. Authors should tackle it head on because it's what happens in real life. What is your opinion on this?
Well, I think people talk about the fact that something happens in real life or something has happened traditionally in history as an excuse, and I think that why not? Why not take a different set of dictates to shape your book? I really like it when someone says, "Okay, I want you to write a story, and I want it to have this, this, and this." When Charlaine Harris and Tony Kellner asked me to write my werewolf story, it's werewolves at Christmas, and I had no idea what to do. But then figuring that out was great. So sometimes adding those kinds of limitations can be really creatively satisfying. So I say, yes, it's an issue that needs to be discussed, but how about if we save that for real life and we try some other angles when we're playing with our fiction? I mean, give it a shot once, see how it feels. I think it's a good idea. I think any kind of challenge is worth considering, playing around with.
We have a question from Regina. Now, she asks, she says, some people consider depicting women in fiction as unrealistic, and doing air quotes here. What do you think about it? You were just talking about have a character who is a barmaid in the 18th century, 19th century, and she's obviously powerful. So do you think portraying women as powerful, depicting women in positions of power in fiction is unrealistic?
No, because it's very easy to look at history, and I'm going to be quite academic here, and say, well, it was men who created all these legal documents that made these countries and everything, but at the same time, they had families and they had connections, and women are instrumental in building communities. So it's the women are there in history. It's just that oftentimes people don't choose to look for them, and that's one of the reasons I like doing the kind of archaeology I did back in the day, was that I could look at individuals and see how communities behaved. So I think the power might not always be in the most obvious form. It might be social power. It might be that someone who is the who organizes a very celebrated salon for exchanging ideas. It might be someone who has power because she has a great deal of money for a dowry and she can shape things that way. Power takes on a lot of different forms, and it might not always be the most obvious way. So I don't think it's unrealistic, because there have always been extraordinary women in front of and behind the scenes. So it's just a matter of finding them and identifying how they were influential.
And Okay, I'm still waiting for more fan questions. I guess people, I mean, we have a bunch of people watching, but people don't seem to want to ask questions. Ask your questions, guys. Dana is here to answer them. But me, well, I have lots of questions.
Okay.
Now, we sort of touched on this a bit earlier, but maybe we can go a bit deeper into this. So, geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, despite there being a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors. Plus, there's still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behaviors by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for women and girls? And I'm so sorry if you can hear a dog barking, but that's my dog.
Well, that's okay. I expect to hear my cat yowling outside because she's not sitting in on the meeting with us. There's a couple of things, and it's something I've been sort of learning all my life, since high school when I really started participating in geek culture, is that you show up even when all the rest of the guys in the D&D group are men. Then you say, well, I'm gonna be playing with you, because if they're friends, it's like, well, I can be there. I have as much right to be there. Going to conventions, and it's difficult when I had someone. I was waiting in line to get a series of my comic books signed by a writer who I just absolutely adore, and the young man in front of me asked me if that was the line for the signing, and I said, yeah. And then he starts explaining who the writer is. I'm like, I know, I've got my stack of comic books right here. I've been reading comics since Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was a black and white, indie thing. And so sometimes it's just going to say, look, this belongs to everyone. And so it's hard to show up and represent. I think we talked about representation in fiction of all sorts before. People becoming involved in making sure that women are part of comic book projects and movies. I guess was it Frances McDormand was talking about the notion of the inclusion writer. I'm like, yeah, it's not that hard. There are tons of creative people out there who are women, and get a few of them on. Everyone talks about the unknown young director getting his first break. Well, a lot of great unknown women directors don't get that first break nearly as easily. So go looking for the talent that's out there, and then celebrate your geekdom with your friends. It's like we can all go and squee about X-Men or Queen and Country or anything else. Everyone can argue about Doctor Who. That's one of the great things, is that the potential, the access to these, to popular culture is pretty equal, and just getting representation to change up, I think, is the thing we need to work on.
So going back to crime, mystery, detective thrillers, Agatha Christie is pretty much universally regarded as the queen of the detective and mystery genre. And she's the most best-selling author of all time. Yet she came into prominence at a time when women were still fighting for the vote and for a room of one's own. Do you think Christie's prominence has helped to keep the door open for later female mystery detective authors such as yourself, or even as the genre remained quite male-dominated through the 20th century?
I think the fact that she was as tremendously popular as she was is been so helpful to women, because if nothing else, they say, well, Agatha Christie, the idea of having a Christie for Christmas. Every year there'd be a new novel, and it'd be just in time for Christmas. I mean, that's a huge cultural phenomenon. And whenever you can point to someone like that, and then later on Dorothy Sayers and Nio Marsh, it's like this is a field where women have excelled for as long as this kind of story has been around. So I think looking back at those roots can be quite heartening. It can be really encouraging when you're sort of feeling like you're running into all the walls. It's like, no, these people were brave enough to go and be part of this world, and I need to try to do that too. So it's just trying to be the next Agatha Christie, though. It's big shoes to fill.
Well, somebody will get there eventually. It might be you, Dana.
Who knows? One lives in hope. One works hard and lives in hope, right?
Yeah. um, so now some detective mystery crime genres like noir or hard-boiled detective fiction or even thrillers seem to be very male-dominated, and female characters are always the victims or the damsels in distress. Do you think this is changing as more women start writing in this genre?
I think it's changing. I think it's it's changing slowly. But if you look, and there are people like Megan Abbott and Laura Lippman who write such fabulously dark noir mysteries, and so many others. I think it's always sort of surprising, and I don't think it ought to be when some male readers go, "My gosh, I couldn't believe that a woman was writing something this tough and gritty." It's like it's tough and gritty inside of our minds quite a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And I think the more you show up and populate your worlds with women as well, I think it makes a huge difference. I know I'm suddenly blanking because as soon as anyone needs examples of something, but there are S.J. Roseanne is one. Just tons of people who write noir and do it brilliantly. So it's I think mostly trying to open up the venues and get more of these fabulous women writers in there.
Yeah, we were talking about geek culture just now and about misogyny and sexism. Do you think that there is any hostility towards women in the case of the detective crime mystery genre and community, or is it more of egalitarian, or is it more female friendly?
Oh, that's tough because on the one hand, a lot of people assume that if a woman is writing mystery, that it's going to be a traditional, more Agatha Christie inspired, cozy sort of thing. And I think that's too bad that people imagine that that's the only way, because I want the chance to write everything every sort of genre that I can possibly make. I've liked writing traditional mystery. I've enjoyed writing thrillers. I've enjoyed writing historical or Sherlockian pastiche, and it's too much fun to think that it's too much fun to go outside and explore all these things. So I think the notion that that there does tend to be a lot of that assumption that it's going to it's going to be an amateur sleuth, for example, and it's going to be less hard boiled. But I think everyone I know wants to try everything, because why wouldn't you? If you're in a creative endeavor, a creative endeavor, it's always fun to try something. Like I swear, I'm like, I will never write vampire stories. And then someone gave me the chance, and I'm like, well, I could write my kind of vampire story, and that would be fun. Um, and sometimes the vampires are sympathetic and do-gooders, and sometimes they're quite dreadful monsters. So I think, yeah, it would be too bad to be pigeonholed in one thing, and I know that people are working hard to get past that these days.
Mhm. All right, so we're kind of almost getting to the end of the session. I'm just going to ask a few more questions. Um, Now, one of the reasons violence against women exists is gender inequality.
Yeah.
Do you think that there will ever be a time when there will be complete equality between the genders, and so it will follow that there will be no more violence against a person just because she's a woman?
Let's put it this way. I live in hope that there will be a time when there is equality between genders, among genders. I live in hope that there will be a time where violence against women is a horrifying thing of the past. Um, I don't. I think it'll take a long time, but there's the expression like I might not live to see what I'm fighting for, but it doesn't mean that I have to. I can stop fighting for it. So, what I take hope from is that when people write speculative fiction and you see equal representation there, that gives me hope, because if we can imagine it, we can think about what it looks like and what it might take to get there. So some days I'm more hopeful than others, but it doesn't mean that we can stop working. Though I don't think it's going to happen. Uh,
Anytime soon.
anytime soon. Yeah,
We're probably
alas.
getting there.
Yeah.
I've been thinking recently. I read somewhere, and I can't remember where, that uh, the Vikings, way back in ancient times, they actually had really, really strict laws and rules about violence against women. They did not rape people when they conquered different lands. It was just not what they did. And I read that they had very harsh laws against people who actually were accused of or convicted of rape. Yeah, so if it happened, if it could happen long time ago, back in ancient times when we were supposed to be as civilized as we are now, obviously we can do it now, and it could happen in the future. We just have to keep working at it, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah. It's there are a lot of matriarchal cultures that
Mhm.
were, I would say, much more balanced than what we have now, and we can take those examples and figure out how to employ them today. It's funny because people talk about the past as being more barbaric, but there's still quite a lot of good ideas that kept cultures going. So we take the good stuff and we figure out how to make it work today, I think.
Okay, so we've kind of reached the end. I'm going to ask the last question. Um, Now, you, Dana, have been very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Now, this is a bit of an obvious question, but we ask this to all our authors. Why do you support the cause to end violence against women? And what do you think authors such as yourself can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Well, here's the thing: even when violence against women is not it's not legal and it's not being upheld by society and religious practices, it can still happen, and it's often hidden. And I think the more we speak up about it, as women, as writers, as creative people, the more we can expose it. Because when women thrive, families do better, and when families do better, then communities are stronger. And I think that it's such a simple mathematical thing. If you are able to curtail, eventually stop violence against women, it's going to make the whole world better. It's going to make the communities better, and it's just going to feed off from that. So I think it's just by using the voice that we have as writers, as public people, to bring it to people's attention. That's the best way we have of starting the conversations that will change things.
All right. Um, okay, I'm going to switch the screen to me just for a little while. Here we are. Okay. Hi, guys. So, um, thank you for all your questions, everybody, and thanks, Dana. Now, I promised you just now that I will tell you about the author goodies that Dana has donated and that you can get your hands on by donating. So, as mentioned earlier, Dana very generously donated a bundle of stories goodies, and it comprises one set of a Fangborn trilogy, which is paperback and it's signed and personalized. One copy of Finals is a Fangborn story originally published in Alfred Hitchcock Mystery Magazine, and one The Night That Things Changed, and which is a Fangborn story published in Wolfsbane and Mistletoe, edited by Charlene Harris and Tony L.P. Kellner, and one little gunsnake Fluffy, because Harris have a serpentine farm, which is going to be really cute. Now this bundle is available for US donors only. So I'm going to share a little slide with you guys, which has the link where you can go. There it is. Can you see it there?
Yes.
Okay. So all you have to do to donate is go to our Rally Up page, which is at is.gd/r4p Rally Up IWD 2018. The link is case sensitive, but Regina, our chat box moderator, should be putting the link in the chat box there, so whoever wants to go and check out the goodies can just click on the link and go there. Now, besides Dana's goodies, we have plenty more of author goodies. We have goodies from authors like Lee Bardugo, Lauren Oliver, Molly Harper, Lynn Llewellyn, Karen Rose, Aliette de Bodard, Kimberly Durkin, Jacqueline Carey, so many more. And new goodies are going to be released every week as the campaign gets underway. So do go and check it out. If you want to learn more about our Read for Pixels sessions with the authors that are coming up, please do go to is.gd/read4pixels. Yeah, and please do give generously. All funds go towards raising $1 million for the Pixel Project Celebrity Mayor Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. And if you want to learn more about the campaign and about violence against women and about what you can do to help end it, please do visit the Pixel Project's website at www.thepixelproject.net. All right. So I'm gonna switch the screen back to Dana. Dana, do you have any announcements before we end the session?
Well, I will be doing a number of conventions this year. I'll be going to Malice Domestic in April and May. I will be one of the writer guests of honor at Mekon Writers Convention in Rhode Island in July. I'll be going to Gen Con in August and BoucherCon, I think, in September. So I'd like to meet readers and writers and at those events and get down and talk about these things with you.
Okay. Is your schedule going to be put up somewhere that people can have a look at, see where you are going to be?
Oh yeah, on my website I have a list of appearances and with links to all of them.
Okay, so cool. So you guys can go meet Dana and ask her your questions live. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to our viewers, and thanks for all the questions. And thank you, Dana Cameron, for being with us. We had a lot of fun, and thanks for supporting the cause to end violence against women. And
absolutely. I'll say it's absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. So good night or good day wherever you are in the world. Bye.
Bye.